My name is Nicole Powell. I serve as the Community Education Manager for the Domestic Abuse Project of Delaware County, located in Media, Pennsylvania. And we will be discussing two important campaigns and movements that have taken place as of late as major experiences and occurrences have happened throughout the United States. So, the Domestic Abuse Project of Delaware County falls under the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And every July, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, also known as PCADV, hosts a engaging men campaign entitled #HearMeOut. And it's a campaign challenge designed to engage men in the movement to end domestic violence. And the Domestic Abuse Project in particular also wanted to encourage men to speak up on their own personal experiences of being in or witnessing an unhealthy relationship in their lifetime. And then we also have a very prominent movement called the #Black Lives Matter. This was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. And they do have a website, so we encourage you to look on their website to get to know more information about their mission, although it is stated here what the mission is. But ultimately, it was out of frustration and discontentment with the lack of consequences brought upon individuals who have slaughtered the Black body or mistreated the Black body without consequence from our judicial system. And so it feels like that the Black body is sought after to intentionally be harmed. And it says that the Black body is not valued. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is to encourage that Black bodies are respected and justified in living without harm and no one being reprimanded for doing so. So that's what the Hear Me Out campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement look like separately. And so now we're going to bring them both together as it relates to domestic violence. And domestic violence, we understand, is an enforcement of power due to lack of control. And so when we have conversations and facilitate groups around what we understand domestic violence to be and to look like, we break down a tool called the power and control wheel. And the power and control wheel breaks down all of these categories, starting with physical all the way through threats and coercion. And so what we're going to discuss is break down all of that as it relates to unhealthy relationships and how it's then seen in Black lives in the United States. And so please feel free to add comments or ask questions along the way, and we will be sure to answer and respond accordingly. So without further ado, we're going to go into how power and control looks for Black individuals, Black Americans in the US. So we'll start with physical power and control. We have a current public health crisis with public health equity, specifically one related to Black maternal health. So statistics state that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience pregnancy-related death than white women. And that is due to, again, the lack of consideration for the Black body. And so oftentimes what I have seen as of late is that you have a lot of young African-American women seeking to be involved in Black maternal health to ensure that this crisis does not continue and that there is someone here and present looking out for Black women and their bodies. Another form of physical power and control that Black Americans see is lynching. And so unfortunately, lynching has yet to be made a federal law. So it is still legal to lynch anyone, but lynching is more specific to Black Americans. And in February of this year, 2020, Congress moved to make lynching a federal crime after 120 years of failure. Since February, there has not been any update in terms of what that federal law has been, if the federal law has been passed, but it has been a conversation due to the increase in instances where we have seen Black Americans lynched without consequence again. So we have sexual power and control, something we oftentimes see in domestic violence, but it's also something that is often seen amongst Black Americans, and it's seen in ways like sexual aggression and hypersexualization of the Black body. Some educational tools to really break that down is The Rape of Reese Taylor, which is accessible via Netflix. Everyone has Netflix now, and so we encourage you to look into The Rape of Reese Taylor and educate yourself on what that looks like. Reese Taylor was a young woman who was gang raped by 6 men in 1944 in the South, and none of them were convicted of her rape. They were all acquitted. Again, the lack of consequence is what causes alarm. Hottentot Venus, which is the the exhibit of Sarah Bartman in the 19th century in Europe, of her body literally being put on display as a mockery due to her body of being voluptuous. The fact that she had a larger behind was something that people were seeking to mock and put on exhibit as if it was a foreign object. So the Black body being sexualized and disrespected overall and put on display as if it's abnormal, which it is not. All Black bodies are human and normal, and there is no abnormality to that. And finally, When They See Us is a documentary, or docu-series rather, also accessible via Netflix. And When They See Us is about 5 young men who were falsely convicted of the rape of a white woman. And it's really disheartening to watch. I personally have not been able to get through it. I've only seen maybe half of the first episode, but it is really disheartening to see how our system is, and has been working to call harm and injury and hurt to young Black lives, but especially when they see us, to young Black boys. And so again, that's where the Black Lives Matter movement correlates with Hear Me Out and domestic violence and unhealthy systemic dynamics that cause unhealthy controllable behavior. Any thoughts thus far on what has been discussed regarding sexual and physical power and control in the Black body? So now we have economic power and control, or financial power and control. And how that is seen amongst Black Americans in like systemic racism as a whole is within hiring discrimination, unequal pay, and the judicial system. Hiring discrimination meaning that if you have a certain name, the likelihood of you getting hired by a certain agency or company then decreases because your name may sound too quote unquote ethnic. Higher discrimination and unequal pay as relates to minorities being paid less than their counterparts, even though their credentials may be equal, but their reward is not the same. And so that is a consistent fight. That is something that I know I have personally experienced, but have had individuals advocate on my behalf to ensure that there is equity there. And also in our judicial system, again, we've mentioned already in terms of when they see us, but in terms of the erratic behavior seen upon or experienced upon Black Americans by law enforcement, or even those in the or in the legal field, such as judges and attorneys. And during the climax of the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer, protests took place across the nation as relates to in response to George Floyd's murder. And as we see, there were protesters who were arrested. And even in the midst of this protest and the purpose behind it, there were Black Americans who were still unjustly charged 3 to 4 times more of a bail than their counterparts protesters. And even in the midst of what we're protesting against, the same thing is actually taking place. And so we're looking to eradicate all of that. And one educational tool behind that is Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, where it gives individuals tools to courageously speak up and speak out against these types of experiences, especially in agencies like the Domestic Abuse Project or other nonprofits or other companies and major corporations where you may see hiring discrimination or unequal pay or just unjust actions towards minorities or people of color, but especially Black Americans. Any thoughts, questions around that thus far? So the biggest the term that we have heard over time as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement and eradicating each injustices is the word privilege. And privilege is defined as an unearned advantage or entitlement based upon one's race. And there are lots of privileges that can go along with race, such as age or gender or sexual identity. However, in this conversation, we'll focus on it being based upon one's race. And privilege is just simply, again, going along with the things that you see that Black Americans or know that Black Americans experience simply because they are Black, for no other reason, and that their white counterparts have a leg up simply because they are not Black. And so educational tools to really break that down to encourage advocacy against these kinds of occurrences are White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And one of my personal favorites, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. And both of those are very great tools to engage in and read and then pass along to others who you think will benefit from the conversation to help understand and break down what this privilege looks like and what it feels like as a Black American going through that on a consistent basis. And then we also have the use of children being seen as a point of power and control. And the biggest thing we see here in the US is the school to prison pipeline, where children are tested early in grade school and anticipated and expected to fail, and then therefore lending them to spending time in correctional facilities for their lifetime to come. And the best educational tool that is out currently is The New Jim Crow, a book called Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness by Michelle Alexander. It is a book I have yet to read and am having to build the courage to read in today's current climate. But the school to prison pipeline is a major because we often see that although everyone is able to receive education, the equity in that education is lacking. And so there may not be books available. And even now in a pandemic, we're seeing the inequalities that people have in terms of accessibility to certain things to ensure their education success. And so we're trying to eradicate those things, allow people to see where the gray area is and the downfalls are as it relates to the equitable education that is available to Black Americans versus their white counterparts. And so we're trying closely to encourage voting for school boards to ensure that your school board reflects the students whom you serve, and also ensuring that students have access to things that will encourage their success in their educational institution. So books, and this time Wi-Fi, technology, those are the big things that we have to ensure access to. Teachers that will also look out for their overall benefit to ensure their success to go into higher education and continue their education past high school. And so those are the things that we want to advocate for. Again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, please enter into the chat and we will be responsive. The next form of power and control we see is minimizing, denying, and blaming Black individuals for for their mistreatment. So one of the phrases that we often hear in response to Black Lives Matter is "all lives matter." And a lot of people fail to realize how significant that is in belittling the feelings of Black Americans and how they are experiencing living in a world where our bodies are not valued. And it's not saying that all lives do not matter. It's just a matter of the fact that all lives can't matter until Black lives do. And right now, Black lives do not matter. And another misconception in terms of minimizing this experience is that racism is no longer an issue. In fact, that's more of a denial of it, is saying that racism is no longer an issue. Our feelings and experiences are not valid. They do not exist because since the civil rights movement, everything is all better, which is indeed not the case. We are currently in a modern civil rights movement, and racism continues to be an issue. And the things that we have just stated and discussed reflect that. And there are so many systemic things that continue to invoke racism, whether it be invertly or covertly, but it is still there and it is still harmful to the success and existence of Black Americans. And the way in which we see blame in domestic violence and within the Black Lives Matter movement is if then statements. So, if then statements look like if this person did not do that, then this would not have been the response. So, in domestic violence, we often hear if my partner did not make me jealous, then I would not have to have physically assaulted them. That is blaming the victim for the abuser's reaction or response. And what we do not have control over is how other people respond to our actions. We can only control ourselves. And so we're just wanting people to be held accountable for their actions as it relates to, again, the mistreatment of the Black body. And so here are some links and educational resources to understand what these phrases mean and how impactful they are and detrimental they are to the Black Lives Matter movement. The next form of power and control is isolation. Oftentimes, when the domestic violence relationship, you isolate the individual or the victim or survivor to ensure that they don't have anyone else to go to or any other supports. And so the way we see this in the Black Lives Matter movement is tokenization or tokenizing of one Black person to speak for the rest of the race or culture, which is not possible. Every person has an individualized experience. And so we just want people to be aware and understand that every Black person does not have the same experience. Again, there are different privileges that may exist amongst different Black people. And we just want people to understand that our own experiences are individualized, but as a whole, this is something that we are experiencing where one is expected to reflect and represent the whole, which is not the case. And also with segregation, although segregation, again, is not as directly seen as most people may think. However, it really is. We see segregation again in education, where you have predominantly white schools versus predominantly Black schools in inner cities, where housing is definitely not as well in other areas like suburban areas in certain towns, in certain states, in cities. And so you're seeing segregation and, again, equity. You have lack of education, lack of housing resources, lack of significant housing resources. One say, oh, well, at least they have a place to stay, but is there hot running water? Is the water clean? Flint, Michigan has been experiencing unclean water for years. And now that it has come to the public eye in the forefront over the past couple of years, there still has yet to be any significant change to what their experience is in ensuring that they have clean water. And Flint, Michigan is a place where predominantly Black people reside and live. And so again, that's that isolation, ensuring that there's no equity. And so educational tools to kind of break down what this may look like There are educational resources specifically identified and sought to ensure the success for Black Americans in their education, such as the United Negro College Fund, also known as UNCF, and that is to help African Americans afford to go to school. Historically Black colleges and universities are schools that had to be founded specifically for the education of Black people because we were not able to get educated at predominantly white institutions. We were banned from being educated from predominantly white institutions for the simple fact that we were Black. And if you look back, there are some places or people who have published their rejection letters from these predominantly white institutions or PWIs because they were Black applicants. So historically Black colleges and universities had to be founded and established to ensure that Black Americans received equitable education. And so we encourage individuals to support historically Black colleges and the United Negro College Fund. And I believe, I can't, Mrs. Scott is someone who has given a lot of money to HBCUs in the past few days. So we appreciate people like that who are philanthropists and seek again to support the education and the equity of Black students. Again, if there are any comments or questions, please feel free to let us know in the chat. So we have intimidation as our next form of power and control. Intimidation, as relates to the Black Lives Matter movement, again, we see the destruction of property, displaying weapons, and the hanging of nooses. And destroying property, of course, can be seen through looting, in destroying churches. We've seen white supremacy protests take place or supporters of political figures take place where purposefully they are destroying property that they know is significant to Black Americans. And so that has been hurtful when you see destruction of churches and destruction of Black owned businesses, things along those lines. And when people display weapons, that's for abusers too. It's a kind of a matter of saying, like, this is what can happen if you do not comply with what we want you to do. Same thing with hanging of nooses. Again, you're threatening to use this noose in the event that we do not comply to what you would like. So those are forms of intimidation to ensure that Black people stay in line. And so those are ways in which also abusers may do things in terms of threatening and intimidating their partners to do things to align with what they would want them to do to ensure that they have that power and control over that individual. Okay, so psychological power and control. When we have these conversations in educating around domestic violence, we tend to break down psychological into three different parts, which are verbal, mental, and emotional power and control or abuse. And how the Black Lives Matter movement can see psychological and verbal power and control are with racial slurs like the N-word. Thugs is the new modern N-word. And so that's something that you often hear people identify Black Lives Matter protesters as. We're everything under the sun that is not healthy or progressive or productive to our well-being. The mental control or power that takes place when these things happen have a huge impact on Black mental health. And unfortunately and fortunately in the Black community, we're striving to be more inclusive and understanding of the vitality of Black mental health and its importance, and to seek treatment and therapy and conversations and communication and have these kinds of platforms to speak about what Black mental health looks like, especially in today's society where we do not feel safe or valued. And we also have the idea that we have to always keep stay aware to ensure that we do not become the next hashtag or the next say their name, say her name, say his name when we are approached by law enforcement or by other people outside of our race who deem us to be a threat simply because, again, we identify as Black. And the emotional turmoil is extremely overwhelming. It's seemingly just simply humiliating to have these experiences, to have this feeling, to have these overwhelming emotions where you just literally feel out of control, and it feels like people are just careless to your overall well-being and existence, which is very hurtful. So it's just having the experience of having to feel humiliated and be humiliated is just overall disheartening, and not it should not be acceptable, which is ultimately where we want to get to, where it's no longer acceptable to treat Black people in these manners. And so here's another educational link and resource to understand the impact of these experiences on Black mental health and the African American community as a whole. So, as stated, the month of July is where the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Domestic Abuse Project, as a branching out agency, we focus on the Hear Me Out campaign to ensure engaging men. And during this time, I'm sorry, not July, it's in June, I apologize. And during this time in June, the Domestic Abuse Project sought to specifically not just engage men, but specifically engage Black men due to, again, the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to George Floyd's murder, in addition to Breonna Taylor's murdered. And so we find that the male voice is very significant in movements and productivity. And we feel like it's a voice that can be heard and that resonates differently. And we had different guests of different male advocates of color who identify in various ways as it relates to the domestic violence movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we had, again, this hashtag Hear Me Out campaign. We did a major campaign on social media, and we hosted various Facebook Lives weekly, asking these questions. So what does it mean to be a man? How would you define healthy masculinity? Would you consider the phrase boys will be boys problematic? Why or why not? What do you find to be the most challenging aspect about speaking up? How does this pose a challenge, especially amongst people of color? What do you think are the benefits, especially for adolescents? So, a part of what our team at the Domestic Abuse Project and our community education and outreach department, we work closely with young people. So, adolescents starting from seventh grade on up to college students, and they have different experiences. So, we want to be sure that there are different experiences and highlight what those benefits are as relates to discussing domestic violence in that age group. And so we also wanted to know, what can we do to encourage vulnerability amongst males, because we oftentimes see that there is a silencing of the male experience as relates to domestic violence, because there's a stereotype and historic experience where only males can be abusive. But what we are learning and seeing and encouraging are for males who have been on the victim side, when been victimized by a partner or a family member as relates to domestic violence, to also share that experience, because it's not something that does not happen. It's just less discussed and supported. So that's what we're seeking to do, is to support that voice. We also encourage the discussion around what are stereotypes that we as an agency can help to dismantle through education and discuss it in discussions. And that's what we're looking to do here. So we thank organizations and platforms such as Men Engage to have these questions posed. And why are they harmful? What are the barriers to speaking out against them? How does gender play a role in LGBT trans queer relationships? What about race, religion, and culture? And throughout the month of June, it is also LGBT Trans Queer Awareness Month. So we had amazing individuals who identify as gay men, transgender male as well, and queer, because their voice is so instrumental, and they too are having an experience, especially Black transgender folks are having an experience that is not healthy, that is very scary and unfortunately and violent. And so we're also trying to eradicate those injustices as well. And we also ask, what do you wish people knew about coming out? Because we oftentimes see that a lot of LGBT trans queer folks have not very supportive experiences with coming out with who they are, but especially people of color who have different religious backgrounds and beliefs and cultures as it relates to what is and is not acceptable. So we're encouraging that conversation because we want people to feel supported and advocated for. We want to ensure that we're doing our part to advocate and support them in this experience. Um, and are there tactics of power and control that you believe to be more prevalent in the LGBT trans queer community that we need to discuss more often? What are the barriers to seeking out help for this community? And how can we again be stronger allies for this community? And what can we do to ensure our services are at the highest standard of care? And that's something we want everyone to be able to ask themselves personally and professionally, because we are not a one size fits all agency or community or culture or world. And so we want everyone to understand how we have to support each other to ensure everyone's success and equity along the way in each one's society. So again, we had a very huge social media campaign, and our campaign included social media posts from again individuals who identified as Black men and Black transgender males, or Black gay men, or just men of color in general. But again, we wanted to specifically highlight the Black male voice during the Hear Me Out, Engaging Men campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so one of the posts that we had in quotes from a young man is, violence is never an acceptable answer for justice. Very simple, but very impactful, because it is very accurate that we want violence to end as relates to justice, and we want justice to be served in an adequate manner. Hashtag hear me out, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Other social media posts we were able to have and include were these here. I will not read them to you, but one of them major is stand up for what's right, even if you're standing alone. Speak up and speak out about domestic violence. And this is from an individual who is a transgender male, a Black transgender male. And so we greatly appreciate their vulnerability and words of resistance to ensure that we're speaking up and speaking out against domestic violence and any injustices in between. Action steps. So we can never pose a problem without ensuring that there are action steps to eradicate these issues. And so we want to ensure inclusion. So be inclusive in the ways in which you educate individuals. Have diversity on your staff. The Domestic Abuse Project is really working towards that, and we've been doing a really phenomenal job. So we appreciate leadership to ensuring that there is inclusivity seen amongst staff and diversity as it relates to how we reflect the community that we serve. Again, I'm a team where we specifically work with prevention education, and a lot of the people we work with are very diverse, and so our team has to reflect that. Other ways in which to take action for the Hear Me Out campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement would be to collaborate with local organizations. In the US, we have organizations such as the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. And we also encourage collaboration and partnership with Black Greek letter organizations. The best overall, they are known as the National Pan-Hellenic Council, or NPHC. And what you have listed are the organizations specifically for males, but there are also females, or the female organizations, also known as sororities, that should also be partnered with. And we have had the opportunity to do that. And so we encourage other people to do that, because their purpose of existence is to serve. And so we're serving, we're fighting against injustices and fighting for equality. And that's what these organizations do. Each place may have a specific organization that they have stronger partnerships with, but we encourage those partners to strengthen and to continue to ensure that we are, again, raising voices and ensuring that there is equity in the fight against injustice. So, again, join the movement. That's an action step. Be a part of protests. Be a part of that voice that is silenced. Provide a voice to people who are being silenced, and not just Black people, but even for children. Speak up against their injustices and experiences. Again, for our LGBT trans queer folks, like be advocates for that. Our purpose and mission is to be advocates for not just ourselves, but for other people who are unable to advocate for themselves. This is a picture of amazing Black men who are doing the work and supporting the work, and whom we're seeking to support in the work that they do. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns about anything that has been discussed thus far? No? Oh, thank you.